Briggs's scream tore through the air. I have the right to smash that disrespectful mouth. His arm was raised high, muscles clenched tight, his face red as blood. Bystanders panicked, children hid behind their parents. Someone whispered, "Rewind, it don't miss a second." Alicia didn't back down, her voice cold. "Power doesn't give you the right to trample on people." Briggs's fist hovered in the air. The whole street waited for the crash to explode. That day, the intersection was packed with people. The street like a giant mirror reflecting the midday sun, radiating a scorching heat that made everyone uncomfortable, sweat seeping out as the chaotic sounds of honking horns, street vendors' calls, and heated arguments blended into a restless background noise. The crowd waiting at the red light spilled over the white lines, everyone in a hurry, eyes fixed on their watches or phone screens as if everything would keep flowing on as usual. But right in the middle of that current, Alicia Brown stood still tall and composed, her eyes fixed on the red signal, her breathing steady like someone used to facing the noise. At first, her calm didn't draw any attention, but in a flash that peace was ripped apart as a large man in a police uniform appeared charging straight ahead like a storm cutting across her path. It was Lieutenant Briggs, his face flushed, veins bulging at his temples, sweat soaking through his collar and leaving dark marks on his shoulders. His eyes glared wide, full of hostility and a need to assert dominance, as if his presence alone was a declaration of authority. His breath came hard, thick, with the stench of cigarettes and coffee pouring straight into Alicia's face. The noisy space seemed to freeze as his voice boomed hoarse and sharp. "Who do you think you're looking straight at me like that?" The outburst startled a few nearby. An old woman quickly pulled her grandchild back, her eyes anxious as if afraid the child might witness something they shouldn't. A young man holding a folder stopped mid-step in the rush, then hesitated. Pulled out his phone, lifted it to chest level, his finger trembling as it hovered over the record button. Alicia didn't move, her bright black eyes calmly locked onto the furious face before her, cold in her stillness. Amid the sweltering heat, her voice stayed even and low, not loud, but clear, each word etched into the noisy space. "I'm just standing where I'm supposed to." The reply made the air tilt, not because it was harsh, but because that calmness sliced through the boiling aggression like a cold blade. Briggs paused for half a beat, the corner of his mouth twitching oddly, then let out a dry, harsh laugh, brief and void of humor, laced only with contempt. He bent down, leaning close to Alicia's face, then suddenly spat onto the pavement. The sound of it crackling under the heat made those nearby flinch. He jerked his chin, eyes flaring, each look piercing and full of resentment. "Here, black folks only stand when I say so." Each word landed like a stab, crude and vicious, lingering ears of everyone who happened to hear. The tension tightened, a few passers-by hurried their steps, some faces turned away, but others froze in place as if compelled to witness. A student with a backpack rushed to open a live stream app, raising his phone, high, lips pressed tight. He knew this was a moment that could not be allowed to pass in silence. Horns blared from the cars behind, shouts of "Just go" already rang out but were swallowed by the invisible circle forming around the two central figures. Briggs stood blocking the way, his shoulders heaving like a beast closing in on its prey, while Alicia remained still, her arms at her sides but her eyes steady. That refusal to bow, to look away, was the spark that poured fuel on Briggs's rage. He clenched his teeth until they ground together. His chin trembled, his eyes were bloodshot. He growled, voice dropping low, to add, "Wait, you dare raise your head at me? You think people here actually see you as human? Don't forget, I am the law around here." His voice cracked like a whip across the woman's face, every word layered with insult. Alicia took a breath, her gaze not breaking but growing sharper, lips parting her tone, calm but icy. "The law is not an excuse to trample others." Her words weren't loud, but rang out clear like a needle piercing through the shell tell of Briggs's arrogance. A brief silence followed, long enough for people to feel their own heartbeats. An elderly man with white hair and a cane nodded quietly, then lowered his eyes, afraid to say more. Briggs exhaled hard, a sound like a growl, his chest rising and falling, fists clenched tight, veins bulging on his wrists. Even a quiet act of defiance had now lit the fuse on the fury already boiling inside him. Briggs stepped in half a pace closer, his hot breath washing over Alicia's face, the stench of sweat mixed with tobacco making nearby onlookers grimace. He shouted, no longer holding back, I don't need to be taught anything. If I want silence, I get silence, and I'll shut you up right now. His voice cracked the air, harsh and piercing. The crowd flinched, a few gasps escaped, a young mother quickly covered her child's eyes. The man beside her raised his phone higher and whispered, keep recording. Don't miss a second. The light from phone screens flashed brightly, capturing every movement. In the center of it all, Alicia still didn't move, her small frame dwarfed by Briggs's looming figure, but her eyes held firm. That calm presence became a silent challenge, stoking Briggs's fury even more. He leaned in and spat again, this time near her feet, then threw his head back and let out a loud, raspy laugh, eerie and raw. No one in the crowd mistook it for amusement. They all recognized it as the sound of a man trying to cover his helplessness in the face of quiet resistance. Briggs swung his arm, his massive hand trembling in the air as if just one slight shift would bring it crashing down, but he stopped, the fist suspended, his whole body stretched taut with anger, ready to explode. The crowd fell completely silent. Only the roar of traffic outside the circle, the steady screech of cicadas in the bare trees, and the pounding of hearts in the chests of the witnesses could still be heard. Everyone watched, holding their breath, as if this very moment would decide something far greater than a simple argument. In the blazing sunlight, amid the chaotic noise of the city, the confrontation between Alicia and Briggs had moved beyond a personal clash, becoming a symbol of something deeper. It was clear to all that the fuse had been lit. Now it was only a matter of time before the explosion. The air at the intersection thickened and the blaring horns behind faded into a dull background hum. Passers-by stopped walking, their eyes, fixed on the scene, stretching tighter with every second. A few arms rose phone screens glowing brightly, capturing the moment, each angle a witness to what was about to erupt. Within the circle of unwilling spectators, Briggs remained in front of Alicia, his eyes burning like lit coals. He spoke through clenched teeth, voice dry and sharp. Black women like you are only good at keeping quiet. The cruel words hung in the humid air, seeping into it, making some nearby flinch. That naked contempt wasn't just aimed at Alicia, it struck at the entire community she stood for. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady, her voice low and calm but still cutting. Sometimes silence is the answer. Her reply was soft but firm, like cool water exposing the dry poison of his word. Briggs paused for half a beat, then let out a short, sneering laugh. His shoulders jerked as he looked up, then leaned closer and growled, I'll make sure you stay silent forever. The threat echoed, drawing gasps from several in the crowd, the noise spreading like ripples. Some whispered nervously, voices low and filled with worry. Keep recording, get it all. Phones were raised higher, the footage shaky from trembling hands because everyone knew this was no longer just an ordinary clash. Briggs moved in closer, his breath hitting Alicia's face, the sharp stench from his throat mixing with the suffocating air. He tilted his head, lowered his voice, but the menace in his tone sharpened. In this city, people like you exist only because of pity. If I hate you, one word is all it takes to wipe you out. The crowd murmured, and a man in a white shirt clicked his tongue. Shameless. Saying that right in the middle of the street? A young woman turned to her friend, voice shaken. He talks like justice is his to command. The phones never lowered, lenses zooming in on the veins in Briggs's neck, on Alicia's eyes, burning like fire, but never losing their calm. Alicia raised her eyebrows slightly, her breathing steady, me?" And this time her voice came not as a brief reply, but as a clear statement. "You can shout, you can spit, you can insult, but everything you do only proves that you're afraid of my existence." Her words echoed, leaving Briggs momentarily speechless. He bit his lip, eyes wide, then let out an angry roar, the sound rough but loud across the pavement. "Afraid of you, someone like you? I'll crush you right here in front of everyone, so they all remember that the law is in the hands of the police." He hit the word law like a hammer, his burning eyes set to destroy. The crowd pressed in closer, chaotic voices rising, some urging Alicia on, others trembling for her safety. A middle-aged woman gripped her daughter's hand and whispered, "Look at her still standing like a statue." Her daughter nodded, eyes glowing. "She's not backing down, Mom." Emotions rippled through the crowd. Anger, respect, and tension blending into a quiet pressure now pushing back toward Briggs. But he didn't seem to notice, or chose not to. He leaned in, face close to Alicia's, his voice low and sharp as a blade. "I'll make you regret ever looking me in the eye. And when I'm done, everyone will know where a black woman truly stands." The words slammed into the air, piercing the sun-scorched pavement with a chilling thud. Alicia's expression didn't change. Her voice rose again, soft but steely. "You can use power as your weapon, but don't forget there are eyes watching and recording everything. You think you'll silence me, but it's your own words tightening the noose around your neck." The crowd murmured, heads nodding, sighs mixed in. A college student spoke up. "She's right. He's burying himself." His fingers stayed locked around his phone, the image shaky, but his eyes were sharp and lit. Briggs clenched his jaw, his shoulders shaken. He raised his arm, high fist tight and straining veins bulging like ropes. The crowd gasped, voices mixed and frantic. "Oh God, he's going to hit her." People pushed forward, a few whispered prayers slipping out. Alicia looked straight at the hovering fist, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering, each word sharp like an arrow. "You may lower your hand, but remember my silence is not fear, it's proof of your cowardice." In that moment, a breeze passed through, lifting dust into the air, sunlight glinting off the raised phone screens, each frame freezing a piece of history. Briggs roared again, a guttural howl like a beast provoked as the crowd tightened its circle. People realized that the insults were no longer aimed at just one person. They had become a wake-up call to an entire society. Right there on the dusty street, a black woman stood tall, facing the man, trying to make himself the law, not with shouting, not with violence, but with the quiet strength of her steady voice. And it was that, more than anything else, that turned Briggs, with all his shouting and cruelty, into the one exposing his own rotten core before dozens of eyes recording every second. The air at the intersection suddenly grew so heavy that even breathing felt urgent. The sound of car engines still echoed in the distance. Horns still screeched from side streets, but it all faded into a faint background because the only focus of the crowd now was the sight of Lieutenant Briggs standing in Alicia Brown's path. Children cowered behind their parents, tiny hands clutching shirt hems, wide eyes fixed on a scene unlike anything they'd seen before. Some men pulled their kids back, but their eyes never left the space between the two standing figures, a space stretched tight like a string, ready to snap. Briggs stood there, face flushed, red, thick veins rising across his neck and arms. He raised his broad arm, hand clenched into a fist, muscles coiled like cables, trembling slightly from tension. His voice rang out rough and sharp, cutting into every ear. "You think you have the right to defy the police?" The words hit like a hammer, making several women flinch back. Worried whispers spreading fast through the tightening circle around the scene. A young man, filming, murmured, "God, he's going to hit her." Other phones immediately switched on their cameras, the pale blue glow reflecting off anxious faces, forming a wall of witnesses no one could erase. Alicia stood tall, her frame small within the bulk of Briggs, but her calm presence was what stopped him cold. She didn't bow her head or shift her gaze, her deep eyes fixed straight on his. Her voice came steady and clear, without a hint of fear. "Power does not give you the right to insult human dignity. The words cut through the rising fury like a sharp blade. Briggs froze for a moment, his lips twitching, then his eyes widened further, rage flooding his face bright red. The crowd murmured quietly, some nodding, others holding their breath, knowing Alicia had just spoken aloud what many had thought but never dared say in front of an enraged officer. Briggs let out a roar like a wounded animal, his voice echoing across the pavement. "I have the right to smash that disrespectful mouth." The rough, piercing sound shook the crowd. A few clutched their chests in alarm. Soft gasps escaped like pressure releasing into the charged air. He ground his teeth fist, raised higher, sweat streaming down his arm, tracing the tense lines of his muscles. He stood poised, ready to hurl a thunderous blow at the calm face staring straight at him. The distance between BRIGGS'S fist and Alicia's face was just a few inches. Time seemed to freeze. Every sound faded until only the pounding of hearts remained in the chests of those watching. A young mother clutched her daughter tightly, whispering in fear, "Please don't knot in front of everyone like this." But no one stepped in, as if all were hypnotized, their eyes locked on that narrow space. BRIGGS'S fist hovered, his eyes flashing with violence, while Alicia stood motionless, lips pressed together, her gaze firm like a wall of steel. In that split second, Alicia spoke again, her voice soft but cutting through the air, reaching into the pressure about to explode. "You think power lets you do anything, but the truth is you're turning yourself into a coward." The words struck like an arrow into the inflated chest of BRIGGS'S pride, making his body tremble. The crowd surged with feeling, a few heads nodded, whispers followed, "She's right." An elderly man with a cane closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath as if to etch the moment into memory. Briggs inhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling, fist still frozen in place. Sweat ran down his cheeks, mixing with the lingering scent of tobacco, spreading a foul choking smell through the air. His eyes rolled wildly, the whites burning red with fury. But it was the shaking of his hand, the hesitation in that gap, that made the crowd sense the weakness hiding within the rage. That fist, once a symbol of absolute power, now looked like the image of a man trapped, exposing his fragility when faced with unwavering calm. Everyone still held their breath, the silence deep enough to catch the rustle of a newspaper flipping under a nearby car, the hurried footsteps of someone crossing the street. The child hiccuped, clung tighter to her mother, the mother's hand trembling as she patted her back. A middle-aged man, filming, whispered, "If he brings that hand down, the whole city's going to erupt." And it felt true, every second of waiting stretched like a century. Briggs roared again, the rough cry ripping through the air, making the crowd shudder. But the fist remained suspended, those few inches unchanged. He seemed trapped in his own fury, unable to strike, unable to retreat. The crowd was pulled deeper into the moment, eyes wide, breaths quickening. Alicia didn't flinch, her gaze blazing, lips curved into a cold, silent arc. Her composure became the invisible rope binding Briggs, making him shake with rage, yet still unable to finish what he started. In that moment, the entire intersection felt frozen. The scorching sunlight beat down, exhaust fumes hovered in the air, but no one noticed anymore. All life seemed to narrow into a single scene, a suspended fist and a woman standing tall, calmly facing it. And those few inches of space had become a chasm between an abuser of power and the one brave enough to challenge it, a gap where even the slightest move could plunge everything into chaos. In the thick silence, the crowd waited, each person carrying their own emotion, worry, anger, curiosity, even admiration. But everyone knew they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary confrontation. This was a historic moment where the fist of a man who believed himself to be the law was stopped cold by the unwavering eyes of a woman. And as the light from phone screens flickered non-stop, it all became evidence, truth no one could hide. The tension at the intersection kept tightening, phones held high like extra eyes tracking every slightest move between Briggs and Alicia. Among the crowd, a group of young people near the curb had started a live stream, the screen shaken from a flood of rapid comments by hundreds of viewers. One message flashed across the feed: "WTF is happening?" Those watching through their phones were just as gripped as the real-life spectators because they were witnessing something beyond anything imagined. A police officer raising his fist to threaten a black woman in the middle of a crowded street, and it was all being broadcast live, unfiltered. Alicia remained still, her eyes bright in the harsh sunlight, her face showing no trace of panic. She spoke slowly, each word clear, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Go ahead. My husband is watching." Her words dropped like a stone into a still lake, sending ripples through the crowd. Gasps broke out, whispers followed, and everyone was stunned by how sharp and simple that sentence was. Briggs froze for a beat, his eyes flashing with surprise, then he burst out laughing. His laughter rang out rough and loud, echoing across the intersection, making nearby people step back in unease. He threw his head back, shoulders shaking violently, then leaned forward, smirking with scorn. "Your husband, some coward black man, right? Don't think hiding behind a man will save you. I knocked them down one by one. Not a single one dares speak up." His words were thick with contempt, flung at Alicia like a lash. The crowd stirred, voices rising. "He's lost it saying that out loud in front of everyone." An elderly woman clutched her cane, eyes brimming with silent fury. Alicia's lips curved into a cold smile. It wasn't joy, it was a signal of resolve, a look that cut through the act in front of her. Her voice came low and sharp as steel. "You just picked the wrong opponent." The line hit like an arrow to the chest, leaving Briggs stunned for a moment, then his eyes flared red rage surging to the top. But just then, the crowd erupted in another wave of noise. Live stream chats flooded in instantly. Dozens, then hundreds of comments lit up the screen. "Who's her husband? Is this real? This is insane." Viewers from afar argued, speculated, reacted, some skeptical, some thrilled, but all fully drawn in by the brief exchange. In the middle of the street, the crowd's real voices mixed with the stream of text scrolling across screens, turning the moment into a fireball of attention that could no longer be contained. Briggs growled, his fist still suspended in the air, his shoulders heaving like a beast provoked with no outlet for its rage. The crowd murmured, everyone holding their breath because Alicia had just landed a psychological blow that hit too deep. Her short sentence that her husband was watching was both a challenge and a warning. It didn't just send Briggs into a fury, it planted a question in everyone's mind: who was this husband? Where was he, and what would happen next? A boy in the livestream group shouted, "Yo, look, the comments are blowing up, thousands are watching live now." People nearby leaned in to see the screen, watching the words scroll nonstop. Another young man laughed. The whole world's watching him disgrace himself. And that was exactly it. Briggs didn't realize every word, every move he made had become a public spectacle, impossible to erase. Alicia still hadn't moved, her gaze steady, her face glowing in the sunlight like a symbol of defiance. The line, "You just picked the wrong opponent," echoed in the crowd's minds, each person hearing it differently, but all understanding one thing: this standoff had turned a page. Briggs was no longer just an arrogant cop blocking a woman's path. He now had to face the heavy, invisible figure Alicia had invoked, her unknown husband. That thought threw him off balance. He kept yelling on the outside, but in his eyes something flickered, something sharp-eyed onlookers could tell was doubt. Phones kept flashing light, spilling onto Briggs's contorted, furious face and Alicia's calm, unwavering one. On the live stream, comments flooded the screen. "Where is he? She looks fearless. This cop is finished." Viewers everywhere joined in, and those messages became a kind of rallying cry for Alicia, pushing Briggs further into isolation surrounded by eyes and lenses. What used to be a place where people rushed through had now become an unplanned stage. Dust rose with every gust of wind, the sun still beat down hard, but no one left. Children stayed tucked behind their parents. Adults held up their phones, all attention locked on the narrow space between two people. On one side, a belligerent officer clenching his power through delusion. On the other hand, a black woman with blazing eyes and words that cut straight into arrogance like knives. And between them, that distance, along with the question who is her husband, had turned the entire space into a bomb waiting to go off. In that charged air, Briggs kept hurling curses, trying to bury the flicker in his eyes. But the crowd had already sensed the crack forming, and they waited for the next moment, the moment when the name her husband would appear and flip everything upside down. The intersection at noon sizzled under the heat, still echoing with car horns, but everything felt crushed under the weight of thick, stifling tension. The crowd had fixed all eyes on a single space where Briggs still held his raised fist in front of Alicia Brown. Every usual sound of the city faded into a distant blur, leaving only the tight anticipation as if hundreds of people shared the same heartbeat. In that moment, from the far edge of the packed circle, came the sharp, steady sound of footsteps striking concrete, confident, deliberate, loud enough to make heads turn. Those nearby instinctively stepped aside, a narrow path opening without anyone saying a word. A man in a black suit emerged, his tall frame standing out in the harsh sunlight, every step marking the hot pavement with quiet authority. He didn't rush, didn't flaunt, but his presence pulled every glance toward him. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Who is that? Who is he?" A college student, streaming the scene, shouted to his friend, "Hey, zoom in, something's happening." The sun reflected off his dark sunglasses, obscuring his face and only deepening the sense of mystery that gripped the gathering. He walked straight in each step like a drumbeat. Briggs faltered slightly, his fist still raised, but his eyes darted toward the man approaching, a flicker of uncertainty flashing deep within them. Alicia didn't turn, but her lips pressed tighter, her eyes gleamed brighter, as if she knew the moment had come. When the man stepped into the circle, the silence became total, and every movement he made drew full attention. He stopped slowly, removed his sunglasses, revealing deep black eyes, calm, commanding, not loud but impossible to ignore. A few in the crowd gasped softly, recognizing the look of someone familiar with power and control. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a leather wallet in one fluid motion, then held it high. The FBI badge caught the sunlight flashing bright, sending a ripple of shock through the crowd. Shouts rang out, "FBI! Oh my God, he's FBI!" The live stream shook, comments pouring in like a wave, words dancing across the screens. "No way, this cop is done. Unbelievable." Briggs froze, his fist still suspended, but his eyes now darted wildly, breath coming in shallow bursts, chest rising fast. He clenched tighter, sweat breaking across his temples, dripping dew, and mixing with the fine dust of the street. Just moments earlier, he had been roaring like he was the law itself, but now all that force seemed hollow, meaningless, standing in front of four bold words, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Alicia remained still, her figure caught between the two men, but the calm in her eyes now carried more strength than ever. She didn't need to say anything more, everything had already been spoken through the man's presence. The crowd buzzed with whispers, phones held higher lenses sweeping back and forth to capture the moment. A middle-aged woman exhaled in quiet relief and murmured, "So she had a wall behind her all along." The man in the black black suit stepped forward half a pace, his voice deep and steady, not loud but enough to silence everything around him. "You were about to lay hands on my wife." The question dropped like a hammer hitting Briggs straight on. The already heavy atmosphere exploded. Gasps erupted, whistles rang out, shouts burst into the air, fury and satisfaction crashing into one another like a wave. Live stream comments lit up instantly. "Her husband is FBI. This is the twist of the year. He's finished." Briggs froze his lips, but no words came. His fist trembled still, hanging stuck in midair, unable to strike or retreat. Carter's eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto him, slicing through his breath. Briggs wanted to shout, to reclaim some shred of authority, but his throat closed up. The insults he had hurled earlier now seemed to wrap around his neck, choking him as hundreds of eyes and thousands more through screens watched him unravel. Alicia tilted her head slightly, the edge of her lips curling into a faint line, but she had no need for further words. Carter's question had said it all, enough to stop Briggs's aggression, enough to turn this moment into a public judgment. Camera shutters clicked, phone lights beamed onto the three figures, turning the intersection into an unwilling stage where Briggs's false power was stripped away with nothing more than a badge. The crowd surged forward, people pushing from behind to get a better view. A young man whispered, "This is the end for him." An elderly woman nodded, her eyes lighting up. Yes, he deserves this. Everyone understood that Briggs had just lost all ground. He had once roared, "I am the law," but now he trembled before a man who represented a power far beyond anything he could ever reach. In that space, the echo of Carter's footsteps lingered like a rhythm in every mind. The crowd's fury had been stoked, but alongside it came a spreading sense of satisfaction. They had witnessed a man who abused power being stopped, and the moment had been captured from every angle impossible to erase. Briggs remained frozen, his eyes bloodshot, his breath short and ragged, his hand trembling violently. But he no longer dared to bring that fist down. It was no longer the fist of authority, but a suspended one, proof of helplessness in the face of so many eyes staring directly at him. The crowd waited for the next response, and in that waiting, everyone understood that the tide had completely turned. The black woman, who had been insulted and threatened, now had an unbreakable wall standing behind her, and the officer who once saw himself as the law had become a spectacle under the sunlight and before thousands of witnesses. Inside a cafe not far from the intersection, the usual noise suddenly paused when a group of students stumbled upon a live stream blowing up across the internet. The phone in the middle of the table became the center of attention. Tired faces from schoolwork lit up, and every eye locked onto the screen. What started as curiosity turned into an explosion of energy, like a stadium in the final seconds of a tense game. On screen was Briggs, face flushed, red eyes blazing, fist raised inches from Alicia Brown's face. The footage shook from the camera holder's trembling hands, but that very unsteadiness made the moment feel painfully real, so real it took the breath out of the room. Then came the moment Carter stepped out from the crowd, his figure in a sharp black suit, sunglasses flashing under the harsh sun, each step ringing clearly against the concrete. The image sliced through the suffocating tension, drawing every gaze to the man approaching. When he removed his sunglasses, the depth and sharpness in his eyes froze even the room behind the screen. As he pulled out a leather wallet and raised the shining FBI badge, the reflection on the phone's surface lit up the entire group, and everyone around the table leapt to their feet, cheering. One girl nearly screamed, "Oh my God, FBI! It's official, he's FBI." That cry pulled the whole cafe out of routine. People at nearby tables stopped looking at their laptops, closed their books, and moved closer to see for themselves. Comments beneath the live stream poured in like a flood, lines of text raining down faster than eyes could keep up. Dozens of short, sharp shouts appeared. "He's FBI. This cop is done. End of the line." Every line is a public verdict verdict delivered without mercy. The mood in the cafe spread like a virus. Some burst out laughing, others shook their heads in disbelief, but everyone shared the same thought: Briggs had just dug his own grave. A thin student holding a textbook whispered, "I can't believe it. Thought it was a movie, but this is real, more intense than anything on screen." His friend at the table nodded. "Yeah, but the truth hits harder than fiction because it proves something no one can deny: abuse of power has been exposed." Within minutes, the clip had spread far beyond the original live stream. On Twitter, the video appeared with a sharp caption: "Racist cop raises fist at black woman FBI husband steps in." Shares skyrocketed, numbers ticking upward rapidly. Tens of thousands within less than an hour. On TikTok, edited clips with the pulsing music featured bold white text across the screen: "Wrong cop, wrong time, wrong woman." These videos spread at lightning speed, racking up millions of likes. Facebook was flooded with furious posts, hundreds of community groups sharing and commenting, calling for action. Never had a personal incident become a national topic this quickly. The hashtags #WrongWoman and #FBI husband rolled like fireballs that couldn't be stopped. From thousands to millions of tags, the two phrases appeared on countless memes, statuses, and comment threads. The image of Briggs raising his fist was edited into cartoons. Sometimes the fist turned to smoke, sometimes it shattered under the glare of the FBI badge. Alicia was celebrated in a still frame, standing tall with determined eyes beneath it, the bold words, "She's not alone." These images didn't just go viral, they were printed, posted on street corners, and turned into instant visual symbols. Inside the cafe, no one talked about unfinished assignments or packed class schedules anymore. A female student filmed her screen while commenting, "We're living through history right here, right now." The guy next to her added, "This is truth, captured on video, live-streamed, unedited, unfiltered. That's the strongest weapon." His words brought a hush to the table for a few seconds, then came a burst of applause. They all knew Briggs would never escape this now, and no excuse could undo what millions of eyes had seen. Across social media, long-form think pieces began to appear. One commentator wrote, "The moment Carter held up that FBI badge, he didn't just protect Alicia, he restored a piece of public trust." Another posted, "This is living proof that real power isn't in fists or shouting. It lies in justice and transparency." Every sentence, every share landed like a needle driving into Briggs's already decaying reputation as his image continued to crumble in the public eye. With time, the clip was translated into more languages, now subtitled in Spanish, French, and Japanese. Major international media picked it up, running headlines like, "Cop threatens black woman, FBI husband intervenes." The online world, always hungry for shocking stories, had turned this moment into a global spotlight. Comments in dozens of languages filled the threads beneath the articles, all echoing the same sentiment: outrage at Briggs and admiration for Alicia and Carter. Inside the cafe, the group of students leaned in close around the screen, the light from the phone casting flickers across their young, expressive faces. One student spoke with a trembling voice, "People around the world are seeing what happened. No one can deny it now." His friend placed a firm hand on his shoulder and said, "These screen recordings are the strongest weapon against abuse of power. Without them, she would have been forced to suffer in silence." The words made the whole group nod, eyes lit up, as if something powerful had just been passed to them. While Alicia and Briggs still stood in the middle of the crowd outside, their story had already been magnified 1,000-fold, streaming across every phone, every screen around the world. Carter, with his FBI badge held high, had turned that moment into a historic shift. And the entire world, from one small screen recording, had become witness to a confrontation that could no longer be hidden. That night, the city was lit up, but it wasn't the usual kind of energy. People moved through the streets with eyes still fixed on their phones, watching the clips of Briggs shouting, face flushed, red, fist raised in front of Alicia, replayed hundreds of times across every platform. The evening news opened with that footage slowed down so viewers could catch every detail, the wild eyes of Briggs, the tense veins, the sharp bark of his voice cutting through the busy street. The anchor's tone dropped low, nearly choking, as they said, "This is no longer an accusation, it is undeniable evidence." Every frame, played over and over, became a mirror, held up to the truth, pulling the entire city into a single story. From quiet neighborhoods to crowded late-night diners, conversations buzzed everywhere. People reacted with outrage as they rewatched every word Briggs hurled at Alicia, anger clear in their voices and eyes. In alleyways, young groups gathered, cardboard and markers in hand, scribbling rough but urgent phrases. No more racist cops. First, there were only a few small groups, but soon hundreds joined in, marching through the streets. Their chants echoed through the night footsteps in rhythm, phone flashlights illuminating faces full of emotion. People beat rhythms on trash cans and street poles, the metallic clatter mixing with the chants, forming a drumbeat of anger that spread far beyond what any small protest could normally reach. On one street corner, a veteran with a cane kept walking slow but steady. He wore a faded old jacket, his eyes distant, as if seeing his younger self in a past fight for civil rights. Beside him, a girl around 10 years old held a hand-drawn sign that read, "Justice." Her father explained to passers-by, "I don't want my daughter to grow up in a city where police think they can hit whoever they want." The words spread fast, recorded and shared that very night. While the streets boiled, social media churned with its own storm of rage. Images of Briggs, face-burning, fist raised, were clipped from the video and turned into waves of satirical memes. One drawn showed him as a puppet fist suspended midair. Another added the caption, "The last punch of his career." The online world seemed united in mocking him, tearing down the man who once screamed that he was the law. The laughter wasn't for entertainment. It was how the public turned an abuser of power into a joke, stripping away the last scraps of his fake authority. International media jumped in with full force, major outlets splashing the headline across their front pages, "Racist Cop vs. FBI Agent's Wife." The cover image showed Alicia standing calmly in front of Briggs, her eyes fearless, with Carter beside her, holding up the gleaming FBI badge. The articles didn't just report the event, they placed it within a wider context. Systemic racism embedded deep within law enforcement, with Briggs's actions being only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. A sociologist interviewed for One Piece said that moment wasn't isolated. It's a reminder that injustice is still a daily reality. The difference this time is that there's undeniable evidence. In a small bar where workers gathered after their shifts, the overhead TV replayed the clip. Beer drinkers watched closely, then shook their heads in unison. A man in a work shirt muttered he thought yelling loudly would be enough, didn't expect the whole world to watch. Another added, "I've been stopped by cops for no reason. They always think we'll stay quiet. Not this time." The simple exchange was followed by fists hitting tables with looks heavy with agreement. Outrage had become a shared language, no translation, no prompting needed. In college dorms, lit late into the night, students gathered around laptop screens. The clip, played on repeat, rewound to the moment Briggs screamed, then to when Carter raised the badge. Each time the badge flashed, the room erupted in cheers. But after the laughter, the mood quickly shifted. A black student sat still, eyes wet, and said, "This isn't just her story, it's ours. How many times has this happened without anyone filming it?" The room went silent. No one interrupted. Then another voice spoke. "Now everyone has seen it. There's no denying it anymore." Applause broke out, spontaneous and united. On online forums, posts analyzing each frame appeared everywhere. People examined Alicia's stare, her defiant smirk the tremble in Briggs's fist when Carter arrived. Some pieces emphasized the shift wasn't just about FBI power, it was in Alicia's calm. She stood her ground, didn't bow, and let the world see the truth. Comments poured in, thousands of people agreeing. Each word, each share, pierced through the wall of silence built by those who abused their power for too long. That night, the city felt divided in two. On the outside, the lights still glowed, music still played, and people still walked home from late shifts. But inside, in the hearts of everyone watching, a fire was burning, fueled by anger and resolve. Briggs, the man who once shouted that he was the law, had become the symbol of everything broken. In contrast, Alicia and Carter stood as beacons of belief. Their story surged like an electric current, jolting even the quietest hearts awake. And when the morning papers hit the stands, the bold front-page headlines still carried the same judgment: racist cop versus FBI agent's wife. It was more than just a news story. It marked the beginning of a new wave. A wave of outrage had erupted, and it would not fade easily. The next morning, inside the police department building, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The emergency meeting room was packed, curtains drawn to block the harsh daylight, leaving the space dim filled with the bitter smell of coffee, old paper, and tense breath. Ceiling fans creaked as they turned slowly, making the room feel even more suffocating. On the long table, folders lay scattered untouched, while every eye focused on the screen replaying the explosive clip. Briggs appeared in full detail, face flushed, fist raised, voice screaming insults, followed by the moment Carter held up the gleaming FBI badge. The sound echoed through the room like a silent indictment, and no one dared to breathe too loudly. At the far end of the table, a young officer sat, pale-faced, hands clenched tightly together, and finally, unable to hold back, muttered, "The entire country is judging us." His voice trembled, but was clear, freezing the room in place. A few heads turned sharply surprised by the outburst, but many others remained silent, not disagreeing. They knew he was right. Outside, the public was chanting, social media was flooded with condemnation, and with every passing minute, the pressure on the department grew heavier. At the head of the table, an older superior with graying hair slammed his hand down, rattling his coffee cup, and growled, "It's a misunderstanding. We have to cover it." His tone was firm, though even he didn't seem to fully believe his own words. "We can't let public opinion lead us. We need to control the narrative. Issue a statement, say the footage was edited, taken out of context." His words landed like stones, but in many officers' eyes, doubt was clear. One mumbled from the side, "Edited." The whole world saw it live, but didn't dare say more. Tension rose when a middle-aged officer, seasoned by many past incidents, stood up and shook his head. His voice was firm. "Video doesn't lie." The words cut through the room like a blade through illusion. He looked directly at the superior, his eyes tired but resolute. "We can bury a report, we can ignore a testimony, but thousands of phones captured this. No one can erase that truth." The room stirred, some lowering their heads, others nodding slightly. They too knew the truth had slipped beyond their control. In the corner of the room, Briggs had been silent since the meeting began, his face tense, jaw locked. When he heard the words, "Video doesn't lie," he shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward. His hand slammed down on the table, sending a water cup rattling, and his voice rang out hoarse and seething. "I won't let that FBI bastard take me down," he shouted, eyes blazing, shaking the room. Some officers looked away. Others flinched at the sight of veins bulging across his neck. To him, this was no longer about a clip. It was a fight to protect the twisted version of honor he refused to let go of. The silence hung heavy in the room after that outburst. A few young officers exchanged glances, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and frustration. They knew Briggs had shown his true face, but his presence still made many hesitant. The superior at the head of the table cleared his throat, trying to restore order. Everyone quiet. This meeting is for resolution, not shouting. But even his voice trembled because he too understood that the situation had spun beyond what any internal meeting could contain. The glow from the screen still lit up their grim faces, the clip looping frame by frame. Briggs with his raised fist, Alicia standing tall, Carter stepping forward with the gleaming FBI badge. Each time the image flashed, the room grew more suffocating. An officer near the window whispered to the one beside him, "He thinks silence can cover this up, but no one can stop the people. They're out there and they won't stop." The other nodded, eyes weary, as if realizing that from today their work would never be the same. The meeting dragged on, arguments breaking out without pause. Some called for Briggs to be suspended immediately to calm public outrage. Others pushed back, saying it would be betraying a fellow officer. Some said nothing at all, eyes fixed on their files as if hiding from the storm outside. But no matter what was said, they all knew the department had cracked. The fracture wasn't just in their disagreements, but in the undeniable truth now laid bare. One of their own had abused power, and this time no one could bury it. Meanwhile, Briggs still stood tall, breathing heavily, his hand trembling with rage not yet spent. He looked around the room, met by eyes that stared back, accusing, doubtful, fearful. But it only made him angrier. To him, they were all cowards, and he alone had the strength to stand and fight. His words, "I won't let that FBI bastard take me down," echoed through the room like a declaration of war. Not just against Carter, but against the truth tightening around him by the day. Outside headquarters, dozens of reporters had gathered, cameras peeking through barricades. They knew trouble was brewing inside, and the smallest crack could become tomorrow's headline. Inside, those in uniform sat buried in tension, and the fracture was now too visible to be patched over with orders or reports. That night, as the meeting ended, no one spoke. They left quietly, each carrying a weight of their own. But they all understood this wasn't just about a cop caught on video. It was the start of a storm, one aimed not only at Briggs, but at the system he represented. And inside each of them, a painful question rang loud: would they keep covering it up or finally face the truth? In the vast room of the city hall, golden light from chandeliers spilled over a desk buried in paperwork. Phones rang non-stop, each ring like a hammer striking the eardrum, making the already tense atmosphere even heavier. The mayor sat behind the desk, face gaunt from lack of sleep, printed emails stacked high, each one filled with urgent demands for investigation, transparency, and public accountability. Many letters weren't just from local citizens, but also from social organizations, human rights groups, and even high-ranking politicians who rarely intervened directly. The bolded subject lines read like commands, immediate action required. He picked up another letter, the signature long and sweeping, followed by hundreds of names in support. Angry voices from the live call line left him no room to retreat. This was no longer a scandal contained within the police department, but a political flashpoint that could sink the career of anyone who dared ignore it. A knock at the door broke the moment. A senior aide stepped in and leaned close to whisper, "We can't dodge this anymore." The words were short, but their weight immense, prompting the mayor to close his eyes for a few seconds as if gathering courage. He understood every beat of public sentiment, knew that silence now would be political suicide. The numbers on social media had surpassed millions of views and had spilled into the streets as marching crowds, their chants echoing up to the office window. News cameras were already stationed in front of City Hall, waiting for him to step out. The aide placed another stack of papers on his desk, call logs from major political donors throughout the day. They wanted answers. They wanted to know if the mayor stood with justice or with concealment. The man felt as if two invisible hands were tightening around his throat. On one side stood the police force, an institution he still relied on to maintain order. On the other hand, the people furious and ready to brand him a collaborator in injustice if he remained silent. For a moment he looked out the window and saw waves of protesters passing by their signs clear with bold black letters. The chants, rising in unison and hitting him square in the chest. No more racist cops. That phrase was no longer just a trending hashtag. It had become the heartbeat of the streets. He sighed and placed his pen on a memo, though his hand still trembled. The decision was no longer a matter of personal choice, but a duty that had to be carried out. An independent investigation needed to be launched, and Briggs could no longer be shielded as before. In his mind flashed the image of Alicia standing tall in the street, her face calm in the face of fury, and the image of Carter holding up the FBI badge under a circle of watchful eyes. Those frames had gone beyond a single moment. They had become a symbol of truth, and that very truth was forcing him and the entire system to confront it. The phone rang again, this time from a major news network requesting a live interview. The mayor took a deep breath and looked up, knowing the moment for evasion had ended. The air in his office was still stifling, but beyond the door, the entire city waited for an answer, and he understood that if he hesitated even a beat longer, the wave of outrage would drown everything. On the live broadcast screen, the scene outside City Hall appeared vividly, each camera angle sweeping across the hundreds gathered in the area. Banners held high chants, echoing megaphones delivering sharp, urgent messages. People packed the space, many sitting on the steps to hold their spots, eyes glowing in the night. The camera zoomed in on faces, young activists, mothers holding babies, elderly with silver hair leaning on canes, all with the same expression, resolve and fury. The anchor's voice cut in. City Hall has never seen a crowd like this. Pressure is mounting on local leadership. The footage aired across all channels, pressing heavily on the hearts of everyone watching at home. The crowd wasn't quiet. With each passing minute, the chants grew louder. A group of young people shouted, "Justice now," and the crowd responded in unison, the sound rolling like a wave. Some held up phones, replaying the clip of Briggs raising his fist and Alicia standing firm, reminding everyone why they had gathered. Yells merged with the beat of makeshift drums on metal barrels, each rhythm a warning that patience had run out. A camera panned across a large banner painted in bold red letters, "No room for abusers of power." That image was instantly captured and spread online, shared tens of thousands of times, becoming the defining symbol of the day. Amid the surging crowd, a statement from the police department was released. Briggs was immediately suspended from duty pending investigation. As the news broke, reporters repeated every word over loudspeakers, and the crowd erupted with fury. Some clapped but were quickly drowned out by a unified chant, "Prosecute now." The slogan echoed powerfully, each word hitting the glass walls of the building like a drumbeat. No one was satisfied with just a suspension. They wanted justice, wanted to see Briggs' face trial not get quietly shelved, then protected like so many times before. Cameras zoomed in on a middle-aged woman holding up a hastily printed photo of Alicia, her voice rising above the crowd. She stood tall, so must we. The people around her raised their fists and shouted along, shaking the entire street with their voices. A young man yelled into a group's microphone, "Suspension is not justice. We want a trial." The crowd roared back, "Trial, trial." The chant sent chills through those inside City Hall as they realized the public's patience was wearing thin. News broadcasts cut rapidly between scenes, crowds packed around the gates, close-ups of raised signs. A reporter stood amid the people, sweat pouring yet still shouting into the mic, "I can feel the anger here. No one accepts a mere suspension. The public demands a transparent legal process." That footage filled screens in homes, restaurants, and student dorms. Viewers weren't just watching, they joined in by sharing, commenting, turning every headline into a declaration that the outrage had engulfed the entire city. On the steps of City Hall, the glow of dozens of cameras lit up faces filled with resolve. Amid the cries of "prosecute," now a clear sentiment spread: no one wanted to go home until justice was promised. And that night the city did not sleep, because silence meant complicity, while the rising chant became a collective heartbeat urging the authorities to act. Briggs's apartment reeked of stale beer and cigarettes, the dim yellow light from a ceiling bulb casting a sickly glow over the mess. Empty beer cans littered the floor, takeout boxes lay shriveled and forgotten, the air thick with the stench of mold and grease. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a faint breeze and the distant hum of traffic, but inside the world felt completely shut out. Briggs slumped in a chair, shirt, wrinkled buttons popped open over his heavy torso. He gripped a half-empty can of beer, shaking it violently until foam spilled out, then hurled it to the ground with a sharp thud. Rage climbed up his throat as he roared into the cramped room. "All this over some black bitch." The words shattered into the silence, dry and jagged, stabbing straight back into his mind like a blade. Breathing hard, Briggs staggered to his feet, heavy steps crunching over the cans. He moved toward a crooked mirror hanging on the wall, his reflection dull behind a layer of dust. What stared wax at him only pushed him further over the edge. A flushed face, sunken eyes, hair in wild disarray, the portrait of a man unraveling. He growled, hands trembling as he touched the glass, then suddenly slammed a fist into it. The crash echoed, shards flying, some slicing into the back of his hand and drawing blood. But he didn't stop. He kept punching until the mirror was nothing but a warped wooden frame. In the bare patch of wall, the broken pieces still clung on twisted images of himself, staring back like 100 mocking eyes. Briggs clutched his face, breathing fast blood and sweat, mixing into the air a pungent smell of desperation. He collapsed into the chair, bloodied hands still shaking. On the TV, still on in the background, news coverage played footage from outside City Hall, the crowd's chant of "prosecute" now echoing through the speakers. Briggs's suspension scrolled across the bottom of the screen, the words hammering at him over and over. He clenched his teeth and hissed, "They want to bury me." The yellow light threw shadows across his twisted expression, every wrinkle tightened with rage. For a moment, it felt like everything was collapsing, his pride, his authority, the image of control he had fought so hard to maintain. He reached for another beer, hurling it at the wall. It crumpled on impact, foam spraying across the floor like wounds that would never close. The room was thick with darkness and stench, a perfect reflection of Briggs himself, disordered, warped, saturated in decay. Outside, the city roared with rage, but in here, a man who once saw himself as the law writhed in the wreckage, blood-streaked shards of glass and wild eyes staring back at him from broken mirrors. In that chaos, Briggs found no exit, only a storm of madness spiraling inward, battering his mind like a hurricane turned on itself. The news still played on the TV, the anchor's voice repeating each detail as if carving it into public memory. Then, a breaking banner rolled across the screen, "FBI involved." Briggs heard those 3 words like a thunderclap, his heart pounding as a cold wave spread from the back of his neck to his chest. For a moment, the world around him seemed to shrink, city sounds fading into the distance, leaving only the looped voice of the broadcast echoing like an unspoken verdict. He shot to his feet, fumbling for the phone on the table, face-flushed eyes bulging with fury. The phone slipped from his hand and flew across the room. He hurled it with violent force as if to transfer all his rage into the lifeless object. It slammed against the wall, bounced off, and landed among beer cans and shattered glass. The sharp crack rang out like the mocking laughter of the world, making Briggs drop to gather it with trembling hands and a head ready to explode. Each alert, each comment, chipped away at what pride he had left, and now the involvement of a federal agency was something he had never imagined confronting. His rage twisted into something primal panic, flooding through him, every reaction rough and raw. He stood frozen, eyes fixed on the phone, lying face down, its screen black, like a pit waiting to swallow him. It was like another mirror, one showing everything he had done, every word he'd spat, the disfigured pride now crumbling away. The fury boiled over, no longer a private shame, but a sharp-edged instinct to lash out. Briggs brushed aside the shards of glass, marched to the window, gripped the curtain taut, and stared down at the chanting crowd, the same images still burning in his mind from the television moments before. His own bitter laugh echoed in his head, and through clenched teeth his voice came out like twisted wire. "I'll I'll drag them down with me." The words spilled out like a curse, not a declaration of defiance, but the oath of a man cornered bent on making others suffer alongside his downfall. He saw a vision of revenge, pictured the consequences he could set in motion, a chain of destruction that spared no one. That thought alone made his eyes gleam with something dark and feral. The sound of his vow hung in the air like a contagion, infecting his heart with even crueler resolve. Blood still clung to the back of his hand as he slammed it against the table, dramatizing his despair with brute force. The sharp crack of fist on wood echoed through the room, then stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence, filled only with ragged breaths and a pounding heartbeat. He looked around the chaotic apartment as if searching for a witness to erase all traces, but the more he looked, the clearer he saw what he was losing: credibility, position, and the shield of authority that once protected him from above. For a brief moment, Briggs questioned the path that led him here, the small acts that piled up into a power so unchecked it bred arrogance. But that question was quickly choked out by the flood of noise from outside, by loudspeakers, by a rising tide of online comments, by the image of Alicia standing tall each time the news played back. Instead of reckoning, he chose retaliation, chose to inflict pain, and that choice made the air around him turn cold as stone. His earlier words sounded like a promise for a new chapter soaked in chaos. Outside, the city moved on, streetlights flickering to life one by one. But inside the beer-soaked apartment, Briggs was busy sketching the pitiful plans of a cornered man. The TV repeated his name, and he repeated his silent vow, each unspoken syllable another brick in the wall rising between him and the world outside, a barricade he was certain could drag down anyone who dared to step inside with him. Morning at the FBI office, white light from rows of fluorescent lamps poured down over a long table covered in documents, the air cold and still enough to hear every page turn. On the tabletop, a thick file, clearly labeled with BRIGGS'S name, sat neatly in front of Carter. He looked down at the file cover, his gaze steady but layered, one hand resting on it as if it weighed more than usual. In his mind, the image of Alicia standing tall in the street and BRIGGS'S suspended fist remained etched, tangled with the chants of the crowd he knew would echo for a long time. Carter took a deep breath, then looked up, his voice low and firm. "I want to recuse myself from this case as it directly involves my family." The room paused for a moment, his colleagues exchanging glances, all understanding he was torn between duty and the role of a husband. The FBI director, a silver-haired man with piercing eyes, put down his pen after hearing Carter. He folded his arms, leaned forward, and spoke in a voice that rang clearly through the still room. "We want full transparency." Each word carried weight, leaving no space for evasion. He stressed that this case was no longer personal. It had become a national flashpoint, and Carter's personal connection was precisely why he had to stay, because the truth needed to be faced by those brave enough to handle it. His fingers tapped the Briggs file, each tap landing like punctuation. There is no way forward but through the light. Carter sat still, eyes fixed on the file. Within him, two roles collided. Part of him wanted to shield his wife from the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The other knew he was a critical link in the legal chain. The strain showed on his face, but the resolve in his eyes revealed he understood what the director's refusal truly meant. If he stepped back, he could protect his family's privacy, but he would also be turning his back on the justice he'd sworn to uphold. That choice, difficult as it was, had nearly been made for him. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, but not uselessly tense. It carried a grim clarity. Stacked files, clipped video stills, witness statements, and digital forensic analyses were all laid out methodically, everything prepared to dissect every layer of BRIGGS'S behavior. The director stated firmly that this wasn't just about one officer abusing power. It was about investigating the entire system that had allowed him to exist unchecked for so long. and Carter, in his unique position, would be the key link ensuring that the process couldn't be distorted. In that moment, Carter took a deep breath, placed his steady hand firmly on the file cover, and nodded. The white light cast across his face reflected a sense of resolve. Outside the office, the city still shook with protests and outrage, but inside this room a decision had been made. Briggs was no longer just a name in a file, but a symbol of a public battle between truth and concealment, and Carter would not back down because now justice was no longer an abstract idea, it was tied to the woman he loved. Immediately after the decision was made, the FBI director signed the order to establish an independent investigative unit. It was composed of seasoned agents, none of whom had any direct ties to the local police department, ensuring full objectivity. They entered the meeting room with stern expressions, carrying thick document cases, laptops, and analysis equipment. Each member was briefly introduced, from image forensics specialists to investigators experienced in organized crime. Their presence thickened the already heavy atmosphere, each footstep like a silent declaration that the truth would be dissected to the core. Carter sat across from them, eyes focused, knowing he was no longer just personally involved, but now a key witness in an irreversible legal process. The team's first task was to collect the original footage of the live stream that had shaken the nation. Specialized equipment was brought in, and a large screen in the meeting room lit up, displaying every frame of that pivotal afternoon. The audio echoed Briggs's shouting, the crowd's noise, the steady breath of Alicia as she faced the raised fist. The tech experts began their analysis, examining every detail to confirm the footage's authenticity, enlarging each pixel, isolating every sound layer. One agent explained, "We need to be certain there's no editing, because any excuse will try to use that." For the next several hours, no one took their eyes off the screen. They rewound and replayed the moment Briggs raised his fist, magnifying each of his movements to expose the aggression. When Carter stepped forward and the FBI badge flashed, the analysts froze the frame, checking the lighting angle, even examining reflections in surrounding sunglasses to ensure nothing was staged. All data pointed to one clear result: the footage was entirely original, with no splicing, no external tampering. The truth stood visible, and there was no escape route left for Briggs. When the final analysis results were announced, the room fell silent. The FBI director tapped his pen against the table, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is irrefutable evidence." The bold lines printed in the technical report confirmed it like a verdict already etched in stone. Carter sat motionless, his eyes slightly downcast, but his hands clenched, a surge of unnameable emotion rising inside him. He knew this meant Briggs would no longer have room to deny, and it also meant that his wife's ordeal had now become a milestone in the fight against abuse of power. Outside the conference room, the long corridors of FBI headquarters remained brightly lit, every agent's footsteps echoing, evoking the sense of a massive machine in motion. From one moment on the street, the story had now reached the heart of federal authority, and every link was now bound to the same chain. The truth had been proven by science, by data, and there was no other path left but to bring it to justice. And as the conference room door opened, the cold light from the hallway spilled in, and everyone involved understood that the journey ahead would be far more grueling, because they were no longer just confronting one man, but an entrenched darkness that had shadowed the system for years. Inside the narrow interrogation room, the white ceiling light beamed directly onto the cold metal table, casting a harsh glare at the center. Briggs leaned back in his chair, hands tightly clasped, his face weary but still clinging to defiance. Beads of sweat ran down from his temples to his cheeks, not just from the heat of the lamp, but from the pressure of the situation. An agent opened a file, voice calm but firm. "Please recount the incident exactly exactly as it happened. Briggs took a deep breath, then spoke with what seemed like confidence. She provoked me first, used challenging language that made me lose control. He raised his chin, trying to appear as if defending his personal honor, his eyes flashing with provocation. The statement was recorded, but the mood in the room remained unchanged. A direct eyewitness was brought in, a middle-aged woman who had filmed the video on her phone. She sat across from Briggs, her gaze calm but resolute. When asked by the agent, she didn't hesitate. Alicia didn't provoke anyone. I was there. I saw and heard everything. It was Briggs who started it. He blocked her path, yelled at her, insulted her, and raised his fist. Her account was clear, each word like a needle piercing through Briggs's claim. Briggs flinched, his eyes darting, fingers tightening slightly. He turned to challenge her, voice low and defensive. "You were standing far away. How could you know for sure?" But immediately the agent pulled up the original clip on the wall-mounted screen. The audio filled the room. Briggs shouting, hurling insults, unmistakable and loud, mixed with Alicia's calm voice responding. The scene was crystal clear, making his denial pointless. The witness pointed firmly at the screen, her voice unwavering. "This is the proof. Not just my ears heard it, the entire world did." The room grew heavier, and Briggs slumped in his chair, eyes half closed as if trying to escape the pressure. But the white light bore down with no place to hide. Another agent stepped in, voice cold as steel. "You said she provoked you, then pointed out in the footage. You may not like the way she looked at you, but that's not provocation." Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came. The statements he had just made now became the trap he'd set for himself. The contradiction between testimony and evidence, between truth and lies, stood out as clearly as a fracture across glass. In that moment, Briggs felt the whole world turn its back on him. The soft clicking of the investigator's pen echoed steadily like the slow rhythm of a sentence being formed. The entire room was silent, broken only by the replaying audio from the screen looping back everything he had once shouted. Briggs tried to lift his head, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice came out strained, stripped of authority. It wasn't like that." The weak justification fell into the void, disappearing into the heavy silence. Across from him, the witnesses and agents had nothing more to say. Truth had already stood up on its own, clear and irreversible. The video continued playing on the large screen, the cold light from the footage casting a tense glow across the interrogation room. In the opening seconds, the sound of the crowd surged. Then the image showed Briggs advancing toward Alicia, face twisted in anger, arm flung out with force. Everyone in the room watched intently. No detail missed, from the raised fist to the fury in his eyes. The slowed-down clip made it unmistakably clear that Briggs was the aggressor, not reacting to any provocation but initiating the confrontation. An agent pointed to the screen, voice sharp. "This is an act of aggression, not self-defense." The statement hit like a hammer, wiping away every previous excuse. Briggs froze, eyes wide, face drained of color. He felt every gaze on him, some contemptuous, others icy. For a moment he gripped the sides of his chair to steady himself, but the shards of truth flashing before him sent his mind into freefall. His breathing turned ragged, his shoulders trembled, and then his lips began to move. The words came out broken, stuck in his throat. "No, that's not what happened." The voice no longer held power, only panic and despair. Those weak words hung in the air, swallowed by the harsh white ceiling, healing lights like the desperate cry of a man with nothing left to cling to. The agents said nothing more, quietly observing. One of them continued writing in the report pen, moving steadily as if confirming that Briggs's defense had fully collapsed. The witness across the table leaned forward, eyes cold. Everyone saw it clearly. "There's nothing left to deny." Briggs looked at her, eyes wide with panic, pleading for any crack of escape, but the silence remained. The room seemed to close in, white walls pressing down around him, suffocating, while the steady clicking of the pen echoed like the slow heartbeat of a final judgment. In that moment, Briggs realized the power that once shielded him was gone. No badge could save him now, no one left to cover for him, only a single video remained witnessed by millions. The silence in the room was so heavy that his rapid breathing echoed clearly. Each stammered, "Oh, that's not what happened," rang like a haunting echo. And even he knew those words could not undo the truth. And right then, for the first time, Briggs fully felt the weight of justice's light, the very thing he once dismissed now shining directly on him. While the interrogation was still ongoing, a secure email inbox in a corner of the FBI office received an anonymous message. The sender was a young officer from the local police department, someone who had witnessed far too much without being able to speak up. The content was brief but shocking. Briggs had been accused multiple times of abuse of power, from unjustified traffic stops to verbally assaulting citizens, even acts of violence. Yet every time someone in the system stepped in to cover for him. Attached were several old buried documents, reports that had never seen the light of day contained in a few files that immediately caught the investigation team's attention. The officer's words carried the weight of internal conflict, as if he had finally overcome fear to choose justice. The information was quickly verified and led to a trove of long-concealed data. The uncovered records showed Briggs had been formally complained about numerous times, with citizen letters filed only to be dismissed as lacking evidence. Each page turned revealed a piece of a dark puzzle where an abusive officer was shielded by the very system he served. Outrage grew within the investigative team as they realized this was no longer an isolated incident but a symptom of a deeper culture of protection. BRIGGS'S name suddenly became a focal point for everything rotten within the system, and that anonymous letter had become the key to unlocking a long-sealed vault. As the information leaked, former victims of Briggs began to emerge. A middle-aged man recalled being pulled over just for a strange look, then publicly humiliated by cruel words. A woman teared up, remembering being forced to stand in the street, hearing racial slurs hurled at her while bystanders stayed silent out of fear. Each story carried its own scar, not just the sting of a moment, trauma that had followed them for years. Now, with Briggs publicly exposed, they found the courage to speak, and every testimony became another strike, healing away at his distorted image. The interviews were recorded, and the voices of victims rang clear, joining the wave of anger spreading through the city. The community seemed to draw strength from each other, each person contributing a piece of memory to build a collective indictment. On media platforms, those stories were widely shared, reigniting public outrage. People no longer saw Briggs as just one fallen officer, but as the face of a system that had long protected darkness. From that moment on, Briggs was no longer simply a defendant in an isolated case, but a symbol of corruption that society could no longer ignore. Major newspapers began covering the story at a relentless pace, with lengthy articles, thousands of words long being published one after another, all focused on Briggs and the records that had been buried for so long. Journalists dug through old reports, compared witness statements with archived data, and cross-referenced them with instances of Briggs receiving suspicious promotions. On the front pages of several papers, bold headlines stood out: "The Secrets in a Cop's Shadow." Inside, every small detail, like his immunity from harassment accusations or case files abruptly closed mid-investigation, was laid bare. The more the public read, the more outraged they became, because every document served as proof of internal protection and deep-rooted decay. Televised investigative programs quickly followed, airing urgent reports with fast-paced segments. Footage showed old dusty file boxes being opened, reporters pointing at redacted lines, and stamps marked insufficient evidence plastered across documents. The hosts emphasized that this wasn't an isolated case, but a years-long process where Briggs benefited from silence at the top and fear among the people. As those clips aired, millions watched, feeling as if a long, thick curtain had finally been torn open to expose an unbearable truth. The pressure from the press made it impossible for the system to stay still. Emergency meetings were called, politicians were forced to speak out, and even those who had once signed off on BRIGGS'S promotions were summoned to explain themselves. The media kept digging, uncovering connections, and revealing how his position had been secured through shady protection. Layer by layer, the darkness was exposed, revealing not just BRIGGS'S truth, but the loopholes that had allowed him to operate under a powerful cover for years. To the public, every article felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of trust betrayed, and their fury rose higher than ever. Amid the media storm, BRIGGS transformed from a police officer once cloaked in authority to a name synonymous with rot. The press painted him as a symbol of corruption, a man who abused his badge to humiliate, intimidate, and assault, then relied on protection to escape justice. People no longer mentioned BRIGGS as an individual, but as the embodiment of everything they despised in a broken law enforcement system. Political cartoons, op-eds, and analysis videos all dubbed him the face of collapse. From a single raised fist caught on video in the street, the incident had unraveled a stack of buried secrets, turning BRIGGS into the epicenter of public rage. He was no longer being judged only in court, but by millions of eyes, millions of words, and millions of voices crying out for justice. And in that fury, society saw him as living proof that when power goes unchecked, it doesn't just destroy individuals, it corrodes the very trust of a community. From early morning, the road leading to the central courthouse was packed with people. The crowd stretched all the way to the intersections holding signs, eyes fixed on the grand gate. The air was thick with anticipation, murmurs, rising and falling, then bursting into chants each time an unfamiliar convoy passed. News crews had set up cameras since dawn, dozens of lenses pointed at the long line of citizens waiting. Television channels broadcast live with anchors constantly updating the situation, and those images spread into living rooms, coffee shops, and street corners. On screen, the scene was clear, a city united, turning the day of trial into a collective event. The crowd came from all walks of life, from night shift workers to students with backpacks, from veterans in worn uniforms to mothers holding young children. They waited patiently, gripping signs that read, "Justice for all or end abuse of power." Some sat on the courthouse steps passing water bottles around, but their eyes never left the gate. The morning sun bore down, but no one left their place. They knew this trial was no longer just about BRIGGS or Alicia, but a measure of society's belief in justice. The loudspeaker announced that the defendant's transport was approaching. The crowd stirred, feet shuffling and pushing forward for a clearer view. Reporters pressed against the metal barricades, microphones raised ready to catch every second. When the vehicle carrying BRIGGS stopped at the steps, a wave of jeers erupted. People shouted through the barriers, "Shame, justice now." The sound thundered, drowning out the engine's final hum. Cameras captured every frame, broadcasting live, letting viewers far away feel as if they too stood in the middle of the crowd. BRIGGS stepped out with a pale face, heavy frame, and unsteady steps. The yelling, the mocking whistles pounded in his ears. His eyes darted, searching for a calm space, but all he saw was a sea of outrage. Security officers flanked him closely, but their protection could not shield him from the hundreds of eyes burning with contempt. Above, a camera panned, slowly locking in on the image of a man who once claimed authority, now lost in a roaring tide, demanding justice. In that moment, the picture of anticipation was complete. People had queued since dawn, the media had broadcast every minute, and BRIGGS'S arrival turned all that patience into a roar. The trial had yet to begin, but outside, it already felt like another courtroom where the public spoke, where every stare, every shout was its own indictment before the judge even spoke. And in that picture, BRIGGS no longer appeared as a police officer, but as a living symbol of corruption brought into the light. Amid the sea of outrage, Carter and Alicia stepped out of the black vehicle under close escort. Without a word, Carter's hand found his wife's, gripping it tightly as a silent affirmation that they would face everything together. His eyes were sharp, unshaken by by the swarm of cameras pointed at them, unmoved by the erupting chants from the crowd. Carter's presence brought with it a solemn air, as if he walked beside Alicia not only as a husband, but as the embodiment of the justice everyone was demanding. Alicia walked beside him, calm but resolute, her gaze unwavering, as if to say she had never backed down and today would be no different. The air around the courthouse was taut, like a drawn string, each second heavier than the pounding of drums. The crowd gathered on the courthouse steps shifted their focus to the couple who had just arrived, and the chants immediately changed rhythm, echoing Alicia and Carter's names in support of the central figures. Reporters pushed and jostled microphones raised, hoping to catch a statement, but Carter kept his eyes forward, his grip tightening as he spotted a few in the crowd holding signs with BRIGGS'S face and the word guilty. The tension was so thick that even the slightest movement felt like a spark that could ignite the whole scene. At the courthouse gates, rows of security officers formed a human wall, but the shouting from behind the barricades pierced through every layer of protection. Footsteps pounded against the stone ground, chants of justice echoed through the air, mixed with the whistles of reporters and the blare of live broadcast speakers, all blending into a chaotic symphony unified by a single purpose. Alicia felt the current rushing toward her, but instead of faltering, she stood even straighter, Carter's hand sending her an invisible strength. Their eyes met briefly, then returned to the crowd where the weight of anticipation pressed down like a held breath. The entire courthouse square had become a furnace, every face flushed from heat and fury, every chant louder and more relentless. People weren't just standing there to witness a trial, but to see the truth brought to light. TV cameras swept across the space, capturing every moment, from Carter's piercing stare to Alicia's slightly trembling hand, from emotion to the crowd teetering like a volcano on the verge of eruption. No one knew exactly when it would explode, but everyone could feel it building. That one signal could turn silent, wading into a seismic roar. And in that very moment, the courthouse doors opened, signaling the start of a historic day with tension so thick it felt as if the entire city were holding its breath. The courtroom was packed, every row of seats tense as if bound by an invisible grip. The white lights from above cast a harsh glow, exposing the anticipation on every face. When the judge gave a nod, the large screen at the front lit up, and the entire room fell into absolute silence. The first sound sliced through the air like a knife, BRIGGS'S voice shouting each insult so clear no one could deny them. "Black women like you," the echo of it rang across the room, sending chills through many, with some glancing toward Alicia seated in the front row. She remained composed, but her hand tightened slightly, and Carter, sitting beside her, leaned in just a bit, his eyes cold under the screen's glow. The clip continued, showing Briggs stepping forward, fist raised, tendons, bulging muscles tense. His screaming voice clashed with the street noise thickening the air in the courtroom. As the video shifted into slow motion, his fist hovered inches from Alicia's face. Every second stretched, every detail sharpened, BRIGGS'S eyes wide with rage, flushed skin, breath heaving like a wild animal poised to strike. The audience held its breath. Some lowered their heads in fury, others clenched their jaws so tightly the grinding could be heard. The image etched itself into every mind. No one could deny this was the killing blow of evidence, a full portrait of unchecked abuse. In that moment, whispers rippled through the room, phrases repeated like a rhythm, unforgivable. This is the truth. Each hushed word added weight, pressing down on Briggs. He sat at the defendant's table, face pale eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist. The large screen continued to replay the scene, hammering home the undeniable reality. The lawyers, prosecutors, judge, and public all watched together, transforming the courtroom into a space where truth spoke louder than any defense. In that instant, every effort by Briggs crumbled to nothing. No excuses remained. No path to deflect the evidence had spoken for itself, and in the stifling silence of the room, the screen showed Carter stepping forward, his FBI badge flashing a moment that flipped the narrative narrative a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is always present. Every gaze turned to Briggs, a man who once shouted that he was the law, now curled inward beneath the weight of conclusive evidence, waiting for a verdict that would seal his fate. As the image of the hovering fist inches from Alicia's face played in slow motion on the screen, the entire courtroom fell into absolute silence. Not a single cough, not a creaking chair, as if everyone had been locked in place by the frame on display. Then, suddenly, a few faint hisses slipped out from the back rows, the kind of sound so tightly restrained it sent chills through the room. A woman raised her hand to her mouth, eyes red with tears, while a young man clenched his teeth, the grinding sound cutting through the thick air. The shock rippled like a wave, making even the audience's breathing feel heavier, as though they were all bearing the humiliation on Alicia's behalf. Eyes filled with anger and contempt turned toward Briggs, forcing him to face the fact that he was no longer a uniformed officer, but a defendant under the watch of hundreds. Briggs now sat frozen in his chair, shoulders heavy as stone, hands trembling uncontrollably in front of him. Under the stark white lights from above his face was pale sweat sliding down from his temples and soaking into his collar. He stared downward, unable to look at the screen, lacking the courage to meet the gaze of a crowd that pierced through him like hundreds of pointed blades. His breathing was rapid, eyes darting in the darkness of his own collapse, reflecting the image of a man who had lost everything. Each drop of sweat that fell onto the metal table left a small mark, the faint drip echoing sharply, intensifying the tension in the room. The courtroom remained still, only the hum of the projector continuing its rhythm. The FBI agents, seated in the front row, didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to make Briggs feel the net tightening around him. Across the aisle, Carter sat beside Alicia, his hand gently holding hers, eyes locked on Briggs with a cold, unwavering stare. That look, combined with the glow of the screen, made Briggs feel like he was being pressed against a wall with nowhere left to turn. Each drop of sweat that hit the table became a mark of collapse, a quiet punctuation, building toward an unspoken verdict already cast before the judge could speak. In that moment, the entire room seemed to stop moving. Everyone, understanding the story, had reached a point beyond reversal. Briggs sat hunched over his back, bent under the weight of his own actions, sweat soaking his collar, disheveled hair partly covering a face that couldn't hide its trembling. No one in the gallery needed further accusations. The sight of him caved in like that had become a living piece of evidence of the downfall of a man who once claimed authority. The silence broke briefly, with a few whispered murmurs, but no one could cut through the tension blanketing the room, because everyone knew the real verdict had already been delivered in the stunned eyes of the crowd. The air in the courtroom grew taut like a tightened string as the judge entered, the wooden gavel before him gleaming under the lights. Every camera lens from the press and live broadcasters pointed toward the raised bench, and millions of viewers watching on screens awaited the decisive moment. Briggs sat, frozen eyes locked on the tabletop, sweat still beating at his temples. Carter held Alicia's hand tightly, both heads held high, their eyes fixed on the judge. The room was silent, with only the sound of the court clerk's pen and the pounding heartbeat of everyone present. When the judge spoke, each word rang out clearly without a tremor. Briggs is guilty of abuse of power and assault. The declaration struck like lightning, tearing through the silence. Outside the courthouse, loudspeakers carried the words, and in an instant the crowd erupted like fire meeting wind. Shouts of justice thundered, swelling into a unified rhythm, echoed through the square. People embraced, many burst into tears, and some students raised clenched fists in triumph. The security barricades trembled under the pressure of the crowd, but this time it wasn't anger pushing forward, it was celebration. The force of that roar seemed to shake the entire city, rippling through every street, ringing in every home tuned into the broadcast. Inside the courtroom, Briggs sat hunched, shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. He trembled, trying to lift his head, but the stares surrounding him forced it down again. The court clerk quickly recorded the verdict, The prosecutor kept a composed expression, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction while the defense attorney remained silent, knowing every effort had reached its end. The judge struck the gavel gently 3 times, each knock solid and final, closing the chapter on a trial the entire world had followed. Outside, the crowd continued to chant justice in a chorus of thousands, their voices joined as one. Banners waved in the wind, television cameras swept across the scene, capturing every smile, every tear, every glance, burning with belief. No one cared about the heat or the crowding. They were consumed by this historic moment when justice had been named clearly. In the small courtroom, Carter and Alicia looked at each other. No words were needed. They knew the fight wasn't over, but the most important step had been taken, and outside the chant of justice still rang, becoming a sound no one would forget on this day of judgment. At the exact moment the chant of justice roared in from outside like a rising tide, Alicia, sitting in the front row, could no longer hold back. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her cheeks, not from weakness, but from the release of everything she had held inside all this time. They were tears of relief, of a faith finally restored. Carter sat beside her, silent, his hand gripping hers firmly as if to say she had never been alone, that he had been by her side from the beginning until justice spoke. The strength in that grasp made Alicia nod slightly, her heart regaining its rhythm, and she looked up, eyes steady on the bench where the historic verdict had just been spoken. Across the aisle, Briggs was flanked by 2 court officers. His head hung low, his face drained of all color, his skin so pale he looked ready to collapse. His eyes were dull, avoiding every gaze, sweat coating his lifeless face like a hollow mask. When his hands were gripped and he was pulled to his feet, he stumbled, his heavy frame stripped of the arrogance it once carried. The image appeared clearly on the live broadcast, and the crowd outside erupted in satisfaction, witnessing the man who once claimed to be the law now bowing in shame. The metallic sound of handcuffs clicked sharply, mingling with the heavy footsteps as Briggs was escorted out of the courtroom. No one saw him as a police officer anymore. All they saw was a convict walking toward the shadows of prison. His face, once flushed red in rage, was now ghostly pale, his lips trembling, unable to form a single word. The eyes of those in the courtroom followed him, cold and resolute, leaving no room for pity. Briggs passed through like a shadow, leaving behind a collapse beyond redemption. Meanwhile, Alicia continued to wipe her tears, Carter's hand never loosening its hold. The image of the 2 sitting side by side, one in tears, the other unwavering, became the symbol of that moment. Television cameras captured Carter leaning in, squeezing his wife's hand tighter, his eyes lit with the unspoken message shared by everyone present that justice is not just a verdict but a restored belief. Outside, the cheers still surged like crashing waves, colliding with the image of Briggs being led away, forming a powerful contrast between the disgrace of a fallen abuser and the strength of a united community. As the courtroom doors closed, the final sounds left lingering were the dragging footsteps of Briggs and Alicia's quiet sobs. 2 opposing sounds, one of downfall, one of release, etched themselves into the memory of everyone who witnessed the verdict, marking it as a moment history would not forget. In a large university lecture hall, morning light streamed through tall windows onto long rows of crowded seats where eager young students sat shoulder to shoulder. On the podium, an elderly professor adjusted the projector, then pressed a button to display the now familiar clip on the big screen. The room fell silent, filled only with the sound of the speakers, the image of Briggs shouting, his fist raised, and the moment Carter stepped forward with his FBI badge played once again, but this time not in a courtroom or on live television, but within an academic space brought in as a lesson. The professor turned around, his eyes stern, his voice resonating throughout the hall. This is a prime example of what we study when we talk about power and professional ethics. The students sat still, eyes fixed on the screen, each showing a different reaction. Some faces were stunned, others with red-rimmed eyes, and a few clenched their fists in restrained emotion. When the clip reached the scene of Alicia calmly standing her ground, the entire class seemed drawn in, and soft sighs escaped into the air. The professor needed no elaborate explanation. Those images spoke for themselves, carving their impact deeply into the students' awareness. He added only one sentence: "Justice is not theory, it is practice, and it must be defended even in the hardest moments." Suddenly, from the middle row, a black student stood up. His voice trembled, eyes wet with tears, yet burning with resolve. As the tears streamed down his face, he still spoke loudly, each word firm and clear. "We have the right to stand tall." His words echoed across the hall, striking the hearts of everyone present. The air paused for a beat, then quickly swelled with emotion. A few students began to clap, and soon the entire class joined in the applause, swelling thunderous and unending. That moment was no longer just a lecture, it became a declaration of an entire generation. Many white students also rose their eyes, reflecting empathy and solidarity, as if to say this was not a fight for one group alone. The applause continued reverberating against the walls, pounding in every chest. The elderly professor looked out over the room, nodding with deep emotion, his eyes glinting with the belief that what he had taught had found its place in the hearts of the young. In that instant, the lecture hall became a symbol of justice carried forward. The lesson was no longer confined to textbooks or syllabi, but lived within real experience in tears shed and voices raised from the soul. And those students, those young individuals, would be the ones to carry the spirit of "we have the right to stand tall" beyond the classroom, bringing it into the world to defend justice through action, refusing to let anyone trample on another's dignity. The emotional voice of the young student was still echoing through the hall when something unexpected happened. The front row stirred slightly, a few students stood up, and that ripple quickly spread throughout the lecture hall. In a moment, the entire class rose to their feet, hands clapping in unison, forming a declaration made of sound. The applause was so powerful it echoed off the back wall, rolling on without pause, as if it could tear the ceiling apart. No one signaled, no one needed to speak, but every gaze, every raised hand said it all. They stood together, sharing a belief in justice. Tears mixed with laughter, emotion, turned into momentum, and the atmosphere caught fire, no longer a regular lecture, but a moment etched in their memories as history. The professor stood still at the lectern, pride shining in his eyes, letting the applause continue as a statement louder than any lecture he could give. He knew that moment had planted something vital, a seed of resistance against injustice, and that spirit didn't stay within the four walls of the classroom. Right after the class, students shared the video clip of everyone rising together, the unified clapping becoming a resonant sound across social media. Within hours, the video spread widely, drawing waves of supportive comments applauding a generation brave enough to raise their voices. On forums, students from other universities expressed solidarity, writing that it was the image they had always hoped to see, and that they too would not sit still in the face of injustice. Conversations sparked in dorm rooms, student cafes, and even out in the open courtyard where young people asked themselves what they would do if they witnessed wrong being done. The wave expanded, transforming from a surge of emotion in a single classroom into a source of inspiration for thousands of other youth. Student newspapers began to publish articles calling it the applause of a new generation. They described the event in the lecture hall not as a mere emotional reaction, but as a shift toward meaningful action, as young people came to understand that justice requires everyone's participation. Social media comments called that spirit a guiding light, turning a tearful declaration into a small movement powerful enough to command society's attention. The way hundreds of hands clapped and stood together captured one truth: resistance cannot cannot be silenced once it has been awakened. In the days that followed, many other universities organized discussions where students watched the clip of Briggs and Alicia together as study material. The applause from a single classroom gradually became a rallying cry for an entire generation, pushing them to reflect on responsibility, on engagement, and above all on the belief that no power can forever hide the truth. From that moment, the spirit of resistance spread, planting seeds for debates, for peaceful marches, affirming that the lesson from the lecture hall had not stopped at theory, but had stepped into real life, becoming a true force. After days of mounting tension, the Department of Justice finally responded with a series of new decisions announced during a nationally televised press conference. The briefing room blazed with light, hundreds of reporters crowded in to take notes, and television cameras focused on the podium. The DOJ representative spoke clearly, each word delivered with weight as if to etch it into memory. Starting today, all police officers on duty are required to wear body cams. As the sentence ended, the room filled with murmurs, many hands raised with questions, but most nodded in agreement. After everything that had happened, no one wanted the shadows to remain those spaces where wrongdoing could hide in silence. The new mandate quickly spread across evening broadcasts, the headline, "Body cams required," flashing on every major network. Citizens breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that the small camera would become an impartial witness, forcing every officer to think twice before acting. On forums, many shared the view that this was not just a technological update, but a critical step toward rebuilding trust between the public and law enforcement. One comment read, "Without those recordings, the truth would have disappeared. Now, every truth will be captured." That belief spread rapidly, becoming a wave of support strong enough to accelerate and unify the policy's implementation. At the same time, the Department of Justice announced another equally important regulation. All officers would be required to complete mandatory training in anti-racism. The representative emphasized that knowledge and awareness cannot be built through reminders alone, but must be developed through training dialogue and rigorous assessment. The news immediately drew attention, especially from critics who had long argued that police training overlooked fundamental issues of human rights. This time, the curriculum was created with the involvement of sociologists, civil rights attorneys, and even victims of injustice, ensuring that every officer would understand the consequences of discrimination and the value of fairness. Major newspapers ran headlines like "From Tragedy to Reform," calling it a milestone of systemic change. In news broadcasts, anchors commented, "A single policy can't solve everything, but it lays the foundation to demand transparency from every action." On social media, posts from students, teachers, and human rights activists exploded, calling it the direct result of collective power. Slogans once shouted in the streets had now become official documents written in black and white for future generations to see that protest had brought real results. In the hearts of many citizens, this change carried more than legal weight. It felt like a gesture of solace for Alicia and others who had once stood up against injustice. Because now, each time an officer walks the streets with a body cam on their chest and the lessons of fairness in mind, the community has the right to hope that the old scenes will not be repeated. And when the applause echoed through the press conference, it wasn't just in celebration of a policy, but a declaration that from ruin had come opportunity, that from tears had emerged a new path for justice. Immediately after the new regulations were issued, change began to unfold, not just on paper, but within the police force itself. Many veteran officers, long accustomed to the old way of doing things and steeped in a mindset of authoritarian power, were placed on transfer lists. The decision sent shockwaves through the ranks, as some of those names had once held high positions and symbolized rigid discipline, yet were now forced to leave key units. Images of them leaving their offices carrying files, their faces hard as steel but eyes tinged with defeat, were captured by the media. These photos were widely circulated, serving as proof of a bold step to clear out shadows those that had lingered for far too long. These transfers were not meant to erase past contributions, but to acknowledge that the times had changed, and that outdated methods had no place in a society now demanding transparency. Some within the ranks reacted fiercely, complaining it was unfair a denial of their entire career. But the leadership held firm, driven by public pressure and the unrelenting protests outside, forcing every decision to be resolute. The Department of Justice stated, "Change is not just about technology. It must begin with people." That statement reassured many who saw that justice wasn't stopping at body cams or classroom training, but was being reflected in the restructuring of those tasked with enforcing the law. Within police stations, the disruption was visible. Empty desks, missing names on assignment boards, and vacancies not easily filled. Yet, alongside these departures came a new wave. Young recruits fresh from the academy or recently completing anti-racism training were appointed to fill the roles left by veteran officers. They carried with them enthusiasm lessons drawn from recent turmoil, and most of all, the determination to prove that the police force could indeed change. A new generation began to rise. They didn't step into the streets with complacency, but with the awareness of those who knew every eye was watching. The body cam on their chest became a daily reminder that every action was recorded, every word left a trace. In classrooms, they had learned about Alicia, about Carter, about Briggs, and those very stories became the moral foundation for their work. The rookies looked at one another, eyes filled with quiet determination, as if silently promising never to repeat the same mistakes. The public saw this change and slowly allowed themselves to trust again. During patrols, instead of wary silence, people began to speak, to smile, to show support. Trust could not be rebuilt in a day, but step by step it was being restored through new faces and hands extended in goodwill. Media outlets reported on young officers helping the elderly cross the street, supporting community programs, and engaging in dialogue with students. Small gestures, perhaps, but clear signs that a new era was unfolding. And so, from the downfall of one corrupt individual, the entire system was forced to transform. The transfer of veteran officers marked the end of an outdated era, while the emergence of a new generation was a promise for the future. It was a generation born from the chants of protest in the streets, from the tears shed in lecture halls, from the thunderous verdicts in courtrooms. They carried the lessons of yesterday into tomorrow, and with both courage and clarity, they became symbols of justice reborn. The central square, once a gathering place for farmers' markets and street performances, had transformed into a space of collective memory. On the large wall, facing the stream of passers-by, a massive graffiti mural emerged after several nights of young artists working side by side. The painting depicted Alicia in a striking orange blazer, her face turned forward, eyes piercing through the crowd. Bold spray strokes captured her fearless aura, hair pulled back tightly, lips pressed together in a silent challenge. Each burst of paint from the can was more than an artistic gesture. It was a proud scream, sending the message that her image would live on in the memory of the community. People stopped to look up, many pulling out their phones to take photos, and in an instant, the moment was shared across social media as a marker of change. Beneath the mural, bold white letters stood out, "She's not alone." The capital letters stretched across the dark wall like a declaration not just for Alicia, but for anyone who had ever been threatened or dismissed by blind power. The slogan needed no translation. In any language, it rang with the same meaning: the community stands with you. When the sun hit the wall, the letters gleamed as if coated in metal, making passers-by turn their heads. At night, light from the square illuminated the mural, transforming it into a silent yet powerful monument. Crowds began to gather at the square in what felt like a pilgrimage. People brought flowers, candles, and handwritten notes to lay beneath the painting. An elderly woman placed a bouquet of red roses at the wall's base, whispering that it was for all the women who had endured injustice. A group of high school students posed for a group photo in front of the graffiti faces, lit with pride, eyes gleaming as if vowing something silently. Elderly veterans passed by slowly, pausing for longer, eyes misting over as they stared at the words, "She's not alone." They nodded, saying nothing because deep down they knew justice often begins with the smallest of acts, carrying the greatest strength. The media quickly caught on. Photos of the mural appeared in newspapers under the headline, "The City's New Symbol." Articles described in detail how the artwork had turned a public space into a site of remembrance and renewed belief. Art critics called it a collective creation, proof that street art could be a political voice drawing the attention of the world. At the same time, on social media, the hashtag "She's Not Alone" appeared in hundreds of thousands of posts, paired with images of the graffiti, turning the simple message into a widespread movement. The daily scene at the square became a living testament to the power of community. On some evenings, hundreds of candles were lit, their flickering lights forming a sea of stars beneath the mural. Songs of freedom and justice echoed from youth groups, filling the square with emotion. Children ran around, pausing to gaze at Alicia's face on the wall, asking their parents about the story behind it. And as parents told the tale, those children received their first lesson in courage and standing tall in the face of injustice. The atmosphere at the square became more than remembrance. It turned into a source of inspiration for action. Volunteer groups held discussions, and human rights activists chose the square as a gathering place to launch new movements. Locals saw it as a symbolic heart of unity, and each time they saw the words, "She's not alone," they felt personally reminded that justice is everyone's responsibility. The giant mural was no longer just a piece of art. It had become a symbol of communal strength, carrying the echoes of truth and resistance ever further. In front of the vivid graffiti wall, flowers began to pile up in clusters, at first just a few small bouquets, then gradually growing into a colorful carpet stretching meters across. People passing by would stop, bow their heads for a moment, leave a rose, a daisy, or light a small candle as if offering respect and gratitude to the woman who had come to symbolize resilience. Cameras clicked continuously as groups of students, families, and visiting tourists stood before the mural. They didn't just take photos for themselves, but instantly shared them online, always with the same powerful caption, "She's not alone." Within days, images of the wall, the message, the flowers, and the glowing candles flooded every platform, spreading like a flame passed from one hand to another. That momentum didn't stop at the photos. It sparked a wave of personal stories. Many wrote beneath their posts that they had witnessed injustice, had felt alone. But seeing Alicia's defiant image on the wall gave them comfort. These posts quickly gained thousands of shares, turning the hashtag from a slogan into a movement where people gave one another hope that truth and justice always have allies. Small gatherings began forming around the square, where people shared their feelings, where generations met at a single starting point. No one had to endure alone. From a broader perspective, the mural and the action surrounding it have become a symbol of collective belief. International media reported on the sight of people laying flowers, taking photos, spreading hashtags, calling it a clear testament to the power of unity. Commentators noted that when a community joins together to turn memory into a symbol, the story transcends a single event. It becomes a spiritual foundation for society to lean on. In news articles, it was called a light in the dark, a light that cannot be extinguished by power or fear. For the city's residents, returning to the square each day became a ritual. They brought their children, told the story of how Alicia stood her ground, how Carter stood by her, and how justice rang out in the courtroom. The children listened, eyes wide, then asked what the words "She's not alone" meant. The answer was simple but powerful. It was a promise that anyone facing injustice would have a community standing behind them. From those explanations, the spirit of resistance took root and began to spread to the next generation. What started as a story on a street corner has now become a shared belief crossing all boundaries. It proves that justice doesn't only exist in court rulings, but also in collective memory, in a symbol made of flowers, candles, images, and words. words. People no longer waited for official statements because they had written their own declaration. And from there, that belief spread wide, becoming the foundation for hope that justice, once sparked, would keep burning, lighting the way for the community's next steps. That night, the FBI headquarters auditorium shone brightly, filled with flags and banners, solemn yet warm. Every seat was taken from seasoned agents to fresh recruits, all eyes fixed on the podium where Carter stood tall in a sharp black suit. The spotlight lit him up, and his voice rang clear, not loud, but strong enough for each word to sink in. Justice doesn't need violence, it needs courage. The line struck like an arrow to the heart, capturing everything he and Alicia had been through, while reminding everyone that true strength lies in resolve and the courage to face the truth, not in fists or power. The front rows nodded, a few applauded immediately, then the clapping spread in waves until the entire room was filled with resounding applause. Beside Carter, Alicia stood quietly, her gaze calm but deep, as if holding the weight of a long, difficult journey. She didn't need to speak because her presence alone was the strongest answer of all. The woman who once faced a furious fist on a street corner, who became the target of vile insults, now stood here as a living testament to the power of bravery. Her eyes moved across the auditorium, pausing on the young faces. Then she smiled gently, a subtle smile, carrying the belief that the flame of justice would not go out. In that moment, silence wrapped around the room, and everyone followed her gaze as if finding a new sense of hope. The ceremony honored not just individuals, but the spirit of unity that society had shown during the storm. On the large screen behind them, powerful moments played on loop, crowds chanting justice, students rising in a lecture hall to applaud the massive graffiti mural in the city square. Each image passed like a reel, a reminder that justice is built by thousands of hands, thousands of voices, and that Alicia was only the spark that ignited a greater wave. The applause returned in fresh bursts, confirming that this story had become a shared legacy, no longer just a family's journey, but one that belonged to the entire community. In the back rows, new FBI recruits sat upright, eyes shining as they listened to Carter. They whispered to each other about duty, about the pride of wearing a badge that now carried a deeper meaning. Many took notes from Carter's speech, posting them online alongside photos of Alicia's quiet smile as an inspiring message that courage and justice always walk side by side. The energy in the auditorium soared, erasing the boundary between those honored on stage and those seated below, uniting everyone in one shared belief in a brighter tomorrow. The ceremony ended, but its echoes lingered. The applause seemed to remain within the walls, Alicia's gaze and Carter's words becoming a spiritual torch. People went home, but in each heart was the belief that the flame would endure, passed from one generation to the next, lighting the way for those who dare to stand up against injustice. And on that final quiet night, as the city faded into the glow of its lights, somewhere in everyone's heart, justice had found its eternal flame. As Carter finished speaking, the auditorium remained wrapped in solemn silence. Suddenly, from the back rows, a young FBI trainee stood up. His applause rang out boldly, triggering a chain reaction as one after another rose to their feet, hands clapping in a thunderous rhythm that echoed like a drumbeat. In an instant, the entire auditorium erupted into a wave of sound applause, merging with unified chants, justice, justice. There was no longer a divide between speaker and audience. They were all part of the same pulse, reaffirming that justice was not a distant ideal, but a living responsibility flowing in the blood of every young person wearing the FBI badge. Faces glowed under the lights, eyes ablaze, reflecting the determination of a new generation inheriting the vow of those who came before. Alicia stood beside Carter, watching the scene with a gentle but deeply trusting gaze. She understood that her story story had grown beyond a personal journey, becoming a foundation upon which the next generation could etch their lessons. The thunderous applause wasn't merely for honoring Carter or Alicia, but a declaration that this new generation was ready to face the fight against injustice. These young FBI trainees had seen Briggs bow his head in shame, had heard the story of the woman who stood tall on the street and now silently vowed never to let history repeat itself. In their eyes, one could see the link between past and present, between pain and hope, between the lesson and the act. The energy in the auditorium burned so intensely that it felt like a fire lit inside everyone present. Professors, seasoned agents, even those known for their stoic expressions could not hide their emotions. They clapped in unison with the students, forming a circle of unity. The power of this moment lay in its need for no promises. Actions alone said everything. Each clap was a pledge that justice wouldn't stop here, but would continue to be guarded by youthful hands, strong and resolved, by new hearts, fierce with a purpose. The flame of justice, once ignited on a street corner where Alicia faced a raised fist, had now moved far beyond the bounds of a single event. It spread to the young class of FBI trainees and from there continued out into society. They would step into the real world with body cams on their chests, with lessons deeply etched from the lecture halls, and with the collective memory that justice had once been reclaimed in its darkest moment. That flame lived not only in memory, but had been placed directly into the hands of a new generation, so that every step they took on patrol would carry both vigilance and belief. This is how justice finds its immortality, not through the strength of one individual, but through its continuous passage from one generation to the next. As the auditorium gradually quieted, the young students' eyes still burned bright, and Carter and Alicia exchanged a smile. They knew their roles were complete because justice had found worthy successors. The flame lit by resolve and courage would keep burning, guiding the new generation forward, ensuring that no matter how many challenges lie ahead, the light of justice would never be extinguished. From the moment Briggs raised his fist in the street to the day the FBI auditorium thundered with applause, the story had traveled through waves of justice and resistance. It all began with the arrogance of a police officer who believed he had the right to impose his will on others, but that very act became the catalyst for a chain reaction that could not be stopped. Alicia did not flinch, holding her ground with calm and unyielding eyes, and then Carter arrived, carrying not the force of fists, but the weight of an FBI badge and a fierce will to protect his family. That image changed everything, turning a personal confrontation into a societal wake-up call. The days that followed saw a social reckoning unfold. The clip went viral, outrage swelled, and the crowds turned the story into a movement for justice. Each comment, each shared video didn't just document BRIGGS'S downfall, but revealed the unity of a people who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. It was the power of community, turning anger into action, turning chants in the streets into pressure that forced an entire system to shift. Because of the hands that held phones, because of the voices that dared to speak the truth, could no longer be buried in the dark. When the case entered the courtroom, the story was no longer just about Briggs and Alicia, but about answering one question. Does justice truly exist within the system? Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every witness presented before the public became a brick in rebuilding trust. Briggs, once arrogant, became a symbol of corruption undone by the very evidence he helped create. Alicia, who once stood facing a raised fist, became a lasting image etched in the public's memory, representing the power of resolve. When the judge delivered the verdict, the chant of justice wasn't just a momentary reaction, but the result of a long journey the entire community had walked together. From that moment, reforms were born. The Department of Justice forced the police force to change from implementing mandatory body cams to training against racial bias. Seasoned officers, long accustomed to privilege, were reassigned, making way for a new generation driven by the will to reform. Trust was rebuilt not just through laws, but through concrete actions, ensuring that every step taken by a young officer carried the weight of protecting human dignity. It was proof that from the downfall of one individual, the entire system was compelled to rise and correct itself. Alongside reform, the community created its own symbol. The graffiti of Alicia, in an orange blazer eyes, sharp and steady above the words, "She's not alone," became a gathering place for thousands of hearts. People laid flowers, lit candles, took photos, and spread that message as a reminder that no one facing injustice ever stands alone. A story from a street corner had become a shared belief, a new source of energy for the younger generation to carry and pass on. And when the FBI auditorium lit up during the ceremony, Carter spoke about courage. Alicia stood calmly beside him, and FBI students erupted into thunderous applause. The flame of justice had been passed to a new generation. The lesson from this story is that justice is not a gift granted from above, but the result of steadfastness and the courage to stand tall in the face of injustice. It reminds us that a woman can face power with calm, that a community can turn pain into strength, that real reform only comes when society refuses to remain silent. The flame of justice, whether sparked by a tear or a cry of anger, can become the light guiding an entire generation. And it is that continuity that makes justice endure, so that anyone facing darkness can believe that behind them stand a community, the truth and the unwavering belief that the flame will keep burning.